Welcome to Badass Stories from Byzantium, a podcast where I tell the whoa, WTF parts of the Byzantine Empire's history, an underexplored and often overlooked subject in Western popular culture. I am your host, Keith Hernandez, and I hope to gently guide you out of the warm embrace of filicidal mothers and into the boiling hot cauldron of medieval napalm. Come with me to the crowd-roaring 30s and a capital on fire. It's mid-January 532 CE, and Emperor Justinian watches in horror as flames dance across the skyline of Constantinople. The night is alive with smoke and shouts from thousands of angry people. His eyes pan from the carnage to the Bosphorus, where the smart and wealthy subjects of his empire have fled on their way to the Asiatic coast. As he ponders fight or flight, a chant fills the air. Nika, Nika, Nika. These words are juxtaposed with proclamations for a new emperor, a lackluster usurper by the name of Hypatius. The commotion is coming from just outside the palace in the Hippodrome, where the very people who started the fire have taken residence. Just who were these people who made Justinian the Great look anything but? One could argue they were simply hooligans. Another, hooligans with many hats. They were most well known as chariot racing superfans, but also they were provocateurs in the theater, chant leaders in the hippodrome, the proclaimers of emperors, the scourge of decent folk, singers of the governor's praises, or sparkers of popular discontent, both at the right price, and fire starters. Of course, according to the work of the late historian Alan Cameron, hooligan is an oversimplification, but one with a purpose, to get the point across that these were young men with too much time on their hands, whose passions exploded at the games of the Roman Empire. He writes in Circus Factions, "The games can serve as a field where the youth who lives an otherwise ordinary and unexciting life can prove himself a man by fighting and destroying, hunting in a pack with his peers. For an hour or two, he can be an object of fear for all those who cross his path. The problems and anxieties that dog his everyday life will be dissipated in the excitement." Hooligans have existed at all times and all places. Look no further than a contentious football game in Europe or South America today, and you'll see them in the street taking their passions out on buildings and police vehicles, as Constantinople's hooligans did to their buildings and soldiers in the 5th and 6th centuries. However, sporting events in late antiquity took on a special role, from the microcosm of the Roman world in the Circus Maximus to the religious and patriotic spectacle in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. Likewise, with their ability to rile up the crowd through carefully timed chants and make acclamations to the emperor himself, these young men too had a special role in society, one that could earn the emperor's attention and gold. But first, let's back up a bit so we can understand how these superfans came to power and threatened a regime. The games were a way of life that opened up the door to all kinds of specializations. Chief among these were the circus factions, the corporations that ran the teams who competed in the games. Byzantium's hooligans were superfans, or partisans of the factions, never numbering much more than 2,000 at a time in each of its largest cities. In the 6th century, you would find most of these faction partisans in the theater and the hippodrome, but also in the streets, the markets, the church, and even the palace, anywhere there were people. We get a description of the partisans in Procopius' Secret History. They sported short hair in the front and long in the back, like the Huns, with a long mustache and beard. Richly embroidered tunics with tight sleeves in the wrist but very wide in the shoulder gave the appearance of big muscles. Lastly, they wore Hunnic shoes and cloaks that concealed short double-edged swords. What united these fashionable young men was their love for chariot racing and their hatred for each other, for there were 4 factions. Each corresponded to one of the 4 colors that had been in use in Rome's hippodromes since the Republic: blue, white, green, and red. Myths have attempted to answer the question of the color's origins. One establishes the reds, whites, and greens as the 3 tribes of Rome, the blues a latecomer. To the chariot fan, who was very much focused on the race in front of him, their origin made no difference. The colors, like jerseys today, made fanatics out of normal people. Pliny the Younger expands on this idea in a letter. It amazes me that thousands and thousands of grown men should be like children, wanting to look at horses running and men standing on chariots over and over again. If it was the speed of the horses or the skill of the drivers that attracted them, there would be some sense in it. But in fact, it is simply the color. That is what they back, and that is what fascinates them. Suppose halfway through the race the driver were to change their colors, then the supporters' backing will change too, and in a second they will abandon the driver and horses whose names they shout out as they recognize from afar. Such is the overpowering influence of a single worthless shirt. During the Principate, we get an idea into how the chariot teams were organized. Elevated businessmen known as domini hired out teams of professional charioteers, likely made up of slaves, to those who provided the games. These hired out teams would compete against each other in hippodromes throughout the empire. This was the birth of the private factions, though they wouldn't remain independent for long, not while the emperors wanted the glory for keeping the people entertained. Over the centuries, the state took over the domini's role in administering the teams. As I said before, each faction had its core supporters, but two, the Blues and Greens, were far more numerous and powerful, taking on a suzerainty of sorts over the Whites and Reds respectively. Therefore, much of their history is written as a history of the Blues and the Greens rather than all four colors. This was reflected in the professional teams themselves, who paired off blue and white against green and red charioteers. The hippodrome was full of these little reflections. Cameron writes, "The arena was like the earth. The track was a circle like the year, with 12 carceres, or starting gates, for the 12 months of the year, 24 races for the 24 hours of the day, 7 laps for 7 days of the week. The 4 colors corresponded to the 4 elements, the 4 seasons. Such fancies were symbolic expressions of real truth." It would be some time from the rise of the factions for the empire to see any use in its partisans. Mostly, they were loyal fans, but occasionally they were troublemakers. The 5th century saw the first faction riot in which Greens and Blues, forced to sit next to each other in the hippodrome by Theodosius II, came to blows. Historian Michael Whitby sets the scene. In his eagerness to have the Greens in full view of the kathisma, or imperial box, Theodosius may have overlooked this vital aspect of public order. The troops moved from the new green seats into the blue section may have intended to act as a buffer to restrain open violence within the hippodrome, but the new seating arrangements might well have encouraged the eruption of violence outside, where the paths of fans entering and leaving their seats will have been harder to segregate than when they sat on opposite sides. This kind of entertainment-oriented violence was not unique to the 5th century. The early empire also saw violence that originated in the hippodrome. Power in numbers and the excitement of the crowd acted as kindling, while contentious races sparked the violence. There were other reasons for discontent at the games, including unpopular ministers and unjust wars, but by and large riots centered around the immediate happenings in the games themselves. Nor was this kind of violence unique to the hippodrome. Theater audiences, especially for pantomime shows, were far more rowdy. There were no regular brawls arising directly from the behavior of charioteers in the hippodrome, as there were from pantomime dancers in the theater. The former had no need to play off the emotions of the audience. Disturbances were often met with emperors closing the theaters and banishing the actors as early as the 2nd century BCE. What was unique to the 5th century, however, was the monopoly of the faction partisans, rather than just the people, on entertainment-oriented violence and the level of that violence, an unintended consequence of bringing theater hooligans into the fold. The factions under Constantius II incorporated the theaters so that by the 6th century, nearly all public entertainment was funded by the state. Naturally, the rowdy theater crowd, who had long-standing rivalries of their own, incorporated the colors as faction partisans. When they became Blues and Greens, this rowdiness extended empire-wide, leading to some of Byzantium's worst riots. This amalgamation of chariot racing and theater partisans was no accident by the state, as the violence it produced surely was, for the emperor finally saw some use for these fanatics. Before the amalgamation, theaters throughout the empire had claques, or small groups of partisans who were hired by pantomime dancers to cheer for them during performances. Clackers' main function was to stimulate and lead applause, which would have taken the form of rhythmic chanting rather than clapping. They would stand 400 strong at strategic positions throughout the audience of 5,000 to 10,000 and wait for signals from their leader. Theater-goers would resist this if the attempt was too obvious. New governors expected to be met with such applause, as well as elaborate acclamations from the clackers, who could just as easily make the same governors sweat from silence or jeering. Historian Wolfgang Liebschutz writes, "When a new governor came to the theater for the first time, the claque would arrange for him to be received in absolute silence. Evidently, the leaders of the claque would be able to intimidate the rest of the audience. The disconcerted official might then have some popular announcement made, by means of which he might hope to win some cheers. This, too, would be to no purpose. Finally, the governor would be compelled to negotiate with the leaders of the claque, and to win their support and cheers at a price." These theater partisans were not moved to act so much by popular consent than by money. To the emperor, who had a sacred duty to attend the games, this power was indispensable. In short time, these clackers joined with the chariot racing partisans, under the payroll of the emperor, to sing, or chant rather, his praises. It was around this time when they were assigned seats in the hippodrome and rioted under Constantius II. This role would become a formal one, in and outside of the hippodrome. The faction partisans would take part in imperial ceremonies, such as proclaiming new emperors and naming imperial family members, but despite their newfound legacy in the 5th century, they were violent as ever. Time and time again, a riot would follow a performance at the theater and break out into the streets. An emperor would shut the theaters down, and the next emperor would open them up again. This was not done so much in the hippodrome, as its crowd was looked at as comparatively tame. Rioters would set buildings ablaze indiscriminately, and the colors would fight each other or the soldiers sent to quell their violence. These outbursts were often looked at as a necessary cost for keeping the people distracted, for the games were more important to the average person than politics. Though faction violence was mainly directed towards each other, the people and even officials were not immune to it. A lot of credence has been paid into the fact that emperors were fans of specific faction colors. It was his obligation not only to attend the races, but to engage as a fan too. The hippodrome was in his backyard after all. Whether they truly favored one color over the other wasn't as relevant as the fact that members of the favored factions saw themselves as the emperor's men. As such, there were times when one color was emboldened by this self-image, such as the Blues under Justinian. During his reign, there were accounts of blue partisans committing robberies, arson, and murder, oftentimes in plain day, to rid witnesses or their opponents, or to just kill random people walking by to prove they could. This went unpunished, as the authorities feared for their own safety, or so the ancient scholar Procopius would have you believe. While untouchable criminals may have been the Roman people's perception of the factions, or the factions' perception of themselves, it was not necessarily true. When driven to action, Justinian harshly punished the Blues as he did the Greens. In fact, it was his punitive measures that led to the fire that raged in Constantinople in 532 CE. Before his ascension, it is written that Justinian patronized the Blues to gain political power, a reputation that would follow him well into the purple, despite his attempts to publicly rid this association. Procopius, clearly with an axe to grind, writes extensively about his and Empress Theodora's favoritism for the Blues, a patronage that was deadly to the common folk and government ministers alike. The Blues saw themselves so far above the law that they were shocked when Justinian's public attempt to quell their violence finally became deadly. On January 10, 532 CE, a group of faction partisans who participated in a riot were to be executed, as a part of the emperor's crackdown on faction violence. 2. A blue and a green were to be hanged, but the execution was bungled, and the two were ushered off by monks to a nearby church. Historian J.B. Bury relays the events in his History of the Later Roman Empire. The Ides of January fell 3 days later, and according to custom, horse races were held in the hippodrome, and the emperor was present. Both the Blues and the Greens importuned the emperor with loud prayers to show mercy to the culprits who had been rescued by accident from the gallows. No answer was accorded, and at the 22nd race the spectators were amazed to hear the unexpected exclamation, "Long live the Greens and the Blues!" The cry announced the two parties would act in concert to force the government to grant a pardon, and it is probable that their leaders had previously arranged to cooperate. When the races were over, the factions agreed on a watchword: Nika, conquer, and the rising which followed was known as the Nika Revolt. A figurative as well as quite literal fire started in the capital. The mob made its way to the prefect's palace and demanded he tell them what he planned to do with the blue and green refugees. But when they received no answer, they broke into the prison, killed the guards, released the prisoners within, and set the building ablaze. From there they marched to the emperor's palace and set part of it on fire. This fire would travel northward and destroy the Senate House and the Church of St. Sophia. The next day, despite Justinian's attempts to distract the factions by offering more games, they set buildings around the Hippodrome ablaze, which spread to and destroyed the baths of Zeuxippus. This was the beginning. An even larger firestorm would pick up when the factions were joined by the common people, already angered by the regime's recent tax increases, a downsize in government services, and a slow response to disasters, among other grievances. Together, the mob demanded the sacking of 3 ministers they felt responsible for the mess, a concession Justinian immediately granted. Bury continues. These concessions would probably have satisfied the factions and ended the trouble, like similar concessions in previous reigns, if the decisions had depended solely on the leaders of the Blues and the Greens. But the movement now wore an aspect totally different from that of the previous day. We saw how the city had been filled by throngs of miserable county folk from the provinces who had been ruined by the fiscal administration of the praetorian prefect and were naturally animated by bitter resentment against the emperor and the government. It was inevitable that they should take part in the disturbances, and the riot thus assumed the character and proportions of a popular rising. The mob, now completely out of control, called for a new emperor. They marched to the house of Probus, a nephew of a previous emperor Anastasius, to proclaim him, but found the house empty, so naturally, they burned it down and moved on. 2 other nephews of Anastasius, Hypatius and Pompeius, were kept close to the emperor for fear of the mob proclaiming them instead. A plot some senators had likely already begun to hatch because of Justinian's inaction. The emperor, unable to rely on his disloyal and immovable guards, finally sent out a military force of 1,500 strong, under the command of Generals Belisarius and Mundus, to quell the revolt on January 15th. But the force was too few to stop the chaos. They fought fiercely in the streets for 2 days. Edward Gibbon describes the street fighting in the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. A military force, which had been dispatched to the aid of the civil magistrate, was fiercely encountered by an armed multitude, whose numbers and boldness continually increased. And the Heruli, the wildest barbarians in the service of the empire, overturned the priests and their relics, which from a pious move had been rashly interposed to separate the bloody conflict. The tumult was exasperated by this sacrilege. The people fought with enthusiasm in the cause of God. The women from roofs and windows showered stones on the heads of soldiers, who darted firebrands against the houses, and the various flames, which had been kindled by the hand of the citizens and strangers, spread without control over the face of the city. Houses, churches, and hospitals full of sick patients were not immune to the fire, which surely Justinian watched in horror, as he dismissed most of the senators, the nephews of Anastasius, and all others he feared were plotting against him. On January 18th, he appeared in the Hippodrome to admit his crimes and ask his subjects for forgiveness, but they did not accept, and he escaped to his palace. Instead, their response was to grab Hypatius from his house and crown him with a golden chain. Hypatius and the senators who conspired to crown him later debated about whether to attack the palace or retreat elsewhere and gather strength. The usurper chose the former option, and the mob followed their new emperor to the Hippodrome, chanting insults against Justinian and Theodora. A very different situation was playing out in the palace. Justinian, overlooking the city and the Bosphorus, contemplated his escape. Who could blame him? Let's take stock of the situation. The combined strength of the faction partisans and common folk have burnt down much of the city, fought off Justinian's attempts to contain them, moved forward a plot by senators to crown a usurper, and were on the verge of expelling the current emperor. It would appear that Justinian played his hand, albeit late in the game, and lost. However, the Empress Theodora was not about to run. She is to have roused her husband's spirits as he was determining an escape route. A supposed witness to the occasion recorded her words. The present occasion is, I think, too grave to take regard of the convention, that it is not meet for a woman to speak among men. Those whose dearest interests are exposed to extreme danger are justified in thinking only of the wisest course of action. Now, in my opinion, on the present occasion, if ever, flight is inexpedient, even if it should bring us safety. It is impossible for a man, when he has come into the world, not to die, but for one who has reigned, it is intolerable to be in exile. May I never exist without this purple robe, and may I never live to see the day on which those who meet me shall not address me as queen. If you wish, O Emperor, to save yourself, there is no difficulty. We have ample funds. Yonder is the sea, and there are ships. Yet reflect whether, when you have escaped to the place of security, you will not prefer death to safety. I agree with an old saying, that empire is a fair winding sheet. This was indeed enough for Justinian to finally act. It would be all or nothing. He ordered Belisarius and Mundus to march out again, this time with a force of 3,000 soldiers, while the throng still occupied the Hippodrome. From either side of the complex, the two generals closed in on the unorganized mob. Bury described the situation. They were cut down without mercy. The insurgents were between two fires, and there was a great carnage. It was said that the number of the slain exceeded 30,000. Two nephews of Justinian then entered the Kathisma, without meeting resistance. They seized Hypatius, who had witnessed the battle from his throne, and secured Pompeius, who was with them. The brothers were taken into the palace, and notwithstanding the tears of Pompeius and the pleadings of Hypatius that he acted under compulsion, they were executed on the following day, and their bodies were cast into the sea. The emperor, suspicious as he was, probably believed that they were not morally guilty, but feared that they would be used as tools in future conspiracies. About a week and one destroyed capital later, the factions and the people were quiet. So too was the Hippodrome for years. The factions would participate in two civil wars in the early 7th century, but only in so much as they were fighting each other. During the moments they were counted on most by whichever usurper held the throne, they abandoned their posts. They would never again threaten a regime, or have the need to. It was their increasing legitimacy in the imperial court that led to their downfall. Faction rivalry would continue throughout the 7th century, but would wither away as the emperor took the factions away from the games and placed them into the palace and the church. I wanted to tell the story because I was fascinated with the power of entertainment to inflame people's passions. It's a story we can easily sit back and judge from the comfort of the future, but by doing so, we would be judging ourselves. As I previously said, hooliganism is not a thing of the past. Look at San Francisco after the Giants won their third World Series title in 2014. 40 people were arrested, 2 people were shot, 1 person was stabbed. All while fires were started and bottles hurled at the police. This was just a mild occurrence to a 2012 riot that left 79 dead after a soccer match in Port Said, Egypt. According to news reports, the two sides battled with rocks, chairs, and knives. More than 70 people were arrested afterwards, and 21 were given the death sentence, leading to even more deaths and rioting. You can see how the excitement spills over into blood all too easily. The modern-day examples are too many, yet it's a part of ourselves we have yet to shake off. Perhaps one day we'll read their graffiti on the wall, but not because we have almost toppled a regime. Those days are long gone.